Racist neighbor calls police on black teen sibling artist gallery event stuns all. Police lights flashed against the white walls of the Palmer Gallery, casting eerie blue and red shadows across the displayed artwork. The crowd that had gathered for the exhibition stood frozen, many with champagne glasses still raised mid-toast. At the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, 17 years old, his hands trembling as he held up his phone, recording the scene. "I'm telling you, Officer Daniels, these two have been vandalizing property in the neighborhood for months," Mrs. Alina Whitfield declared, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. She pointed a finger at Marcus and his 15-year-old sister, Zora, who stood beside a large canvas. "I caught them red-handed this time. Those spray cans in their bags are evidence." Officer Daniels, a veteran cop with salt and pepper hair, looked uncomfortable as his younger partner moved toward the teenagers' backpacks. "This is our artwork," Zora said, her voice cracking. "We were invited here. Everyone was invited here." She gestured to the crowd, many of whom were wearing their Friday best, some still holding programs with the Johnson siblings' names printed prominently on the cover. Mrs. Whitfield scoffed. "I know vandalism when I see it. I've been reporting it for months." Marcus lowered his phone and stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitfield, you've lived next door to us for 3 years. You know who we are." The gallery owner, Mr. Palmer, a distinguished man in his 70s, finally pushed through the crowd, leaning heavily on his cane. "What is the meaning of this? These young artists are my honored guests tonight." Officer Daniels looked from the teenagers to the elderly neighbor, then to the artwork on display, vibrant urban landscapes, portraits of community elders, and scenes of everyday life in their neighborhood, all created with a distinctive style that blended traditional painting with street art techniques. The younger officer pulled something from Zora's backpack. The crowd gasped, and Mrs. Whitfield's expression changed from righteous indignation to something else entirely. But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Marcus and Zora Johnson were getting ready for what should have been the most important night of their young lives. The afternoon sun streamed through the faded curtains of the Johnson family home, casting long shadows across the living room where Marcus adjusted his tie in the mirror. It was his father's tie, one of the few items he had left from the man who had passed away 5 years ago. His mother, Diane Johnson, a postal worker who had raised Marcus and his sister Zora on her own since then, watched from the doorway with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "You look just like him," Diane said, her voice catching. She wore her postal uniform, having come straight from her shift to help her children prepare for their gallery opening. "He would have been so proud of both of you." Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. At 17, he had his father's height and build, and the same serious expression that occasionally broke into an unexpected, dazzling smile. In the next room, 15-year-old Zora was applying the finishing touches to her outfit, a vintage dress from the 1970s that she had found at a thrift store and modified herself. Unlike her more reserved brother, Zora was all movement and energy, her hands constantly in motion, whether painting, sketching, or in this case, adjusting the colorful beads she had added to her dress. "Do you think people will actually buy our work?" Zora called out, her voice betraying her anxiety despite her usual confidence. "Mr. Palmer wouldn't have offered us the exhibition if he didn't think they would," Diane reassured her, moving to help her daughter with a stubborn clasp. "He's been in the art business since before I was born. That man knows talent when he sees it." Mr. Edward Palmer had discovered the Johnson siblings' artwork quite by accident 3 months ago. The 76-year-old gallery owner had been visiting a community center in their neighborhood where Marcus and Zora had painted a mural as part of a youth program. Something about the vibrant colors and the blend of traditional techniques with street art elements had caught his eye. Within a week, he had visited their home, looked through their portfolios, and offered them an exhibition at his prestigious downtown gallery. "I just wish Dad could see this," Marcus said quietly as he joined his mother and sister. Diane wrapped an arm around each of her children. "He sees it, trust me on that." Their moment was interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat pointedly. They turned to see Mrs. Alina Whitfield standing at their open front door, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I noticed several cars parked along the street," she said without preamble. "Your visitors are blocking my driveway again." Diane sighed. "Good afternoon to you too, Mrs. Whitfield. Those aren't our visitors. Must be for the Thompsons' barbecue next door." Mrs. Whitfield, a widow in her early 70s who had moved to their street after her husband's death 3 years ago, narrowed her eyes suspiciously. She had never made any effort to get to know the Johnson family, despite Diane's initial attempts at neighborliness. Instead, she seemed to find fault with everything they did. from the music they occasionally played to the friends who visited. "Well, someone needs to move those vehicles," she insisted. "And what's with all these coming and goings lately? There were vans here yesterday." "That was the gallery staff picking up our artwork for tonight's exhibition," Marcus explained politely, though his jaw tightened. "We're having our first professional showing downtown." Something flickered across Mrs. Whitfield's face, surprise, perhaps, or disbelief. "You, at a real gallery?" The way she emphasized real made Zora step forward, eyes flashing. "Yes, us at Palmer Gallery, you know, the one on Franklin Street. We're the featured artists tonight." Mrs. Whitfield's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. "Palmer Gallery, Edward Palmer's place?" "The very same," Diane confirmed, placing a calming hand on Zora's shoulder. "We're actually running a bit late, so if you'll excuse us." Without waiting for a response, Diane ushered her children toward the door, gently forcing Mrs. Whitfield to step back onto the porch. "We'd be happy to continue this conversation another time. You're welcome to attend the opening tonight if you're interested. Starts at 7. Before the older woman could respond, Diane closed the door and turned to her children with an exasperated smile. "Don't let her get to you. Not today. This is your night." Marcus picked up his portfolio case, which contained a few additional sketches Mr. Palmer had requested for potential buyers. "She's always been like that. Remember when she called the police because I was suspiciously taking photographs on our own street?" Diane shook her head. "Some people are stuck in the past. Mrs. Whitfield grew up in a different time." She checked her watch. "We need to get going. The bus downtown leaves in 15 minutes, and Mr. Palmer wanted you there early to meet some of the critics." As they gathered their things and headed for the door, Zora glanced at her backpack. "Should I bring the spray cans?" "In case someone wants a demonstration of our technique," Diane hesitated. "I don't know if that's appropriate for an indoor gallery, sweetheart." "Mr. Palmer specifically asked us to show our process," Marcus reminded her. "Remember, he said collectors love to see how artists work." "All right, but be careful with those. They're expensive, and I don't want any accidents on your nice clothes," Diane conceded. They left their modest home and walked to the bus stop at the end of their street. From her front window, Mrs. Whitfield watched them go, her expression unreadable. The bus ride downtown took 30 minutes, during which Diane reviewed the speech she had prepared for the opening. As a single mother who had worked double shifts for years to support her children's artistic pursuits, this moment represented the validation of her faith in their talents. "Remember to thank Mr. Palmer first," she reminded them. "And mention Ms. Rodriguez from the community center who connected you with the mural project." Marcus nodded, though his attention was on the passing scenery. Their neighborhood of small, aging homes gradually gave way to the renovated downtown area with its mix of historic buildings and modern developments. Palmer Gallery was located in one of the oldest structures on Franklin Street, a former bank that had been converted into an art space in the 1980s. When they arrived, Edward Palmer himself was waiting at the entrance. Tall and distinguished with a full head of white hair, he walked with a slight limp and used a carved wooden cane, a souvenir from his time as a war correspondent in Vietnam. Despite his age, his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. "There they are," he called out, his deep voice carrying across the sidewalk. "My young revolutionaries, come in, come in. The critics are already circling your work like sharks who have scented blood." Zora looked alarmed, but Mr. Palmer laughed. "That's a good thing in the art world, my dear. It means they're intrigued." He led them inside, where their artwork had been professionally mounted and lit. Seeing their creations in this setting, pieces they had worked on in their small bedroom or on the roof of their apartment building, was overwhelming. Marcus felt his eyes sting with tears, and Zora gripped his hand tightly. "You've done something special here," Mr. Palmer told them quietly. "You've captured the soul of your community, the dignity and the struggle, but also the joy and resilience. That's not easy to do, especially for artists so young." The gallery staff bustled around them, making final adjustments before the doors opened to the public. A photographer from the local newspaper arrived to take pictures of the siblings with their work for the arts section. "I need to check on the catering," Mr. Palmer said. "Diane, would you mind coming with me? There's someone I'd like you to meet, a representative from the Arts Council who might be interested in funding a scholarship." As her mother followed Mr. Palmer toward the back of the gallery, Zora turned to Marcus. "Is this really happening?" Marcus squeezed her shoulder. "It's real." "We did it, Z." For the next hour, they moved through the gallery, looking at their own work through new eyes, occasionally overhearing comments from the early arrivals' art critics, collectors, and friends of Mr. Palmer who had been invited for a preview before the official opening. "The technique is raw, but there's something authentic here. Reminds me of Basquiat in his early days before he became self-conscious." The younger one has an extraordinary eye for color. At 6:45, 15 minutes before the official opening, Mr. Palmer gathered everyone for a brief speech. Tonight, we are privileged to witness the emergence of two significant new voices in contemporary art. Marcus and Zora Johnson have created work that speaks to our time while honoring artistic traditions. Their vision. He was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance. A security guard was attempting to prevent someone from entering, and a familiar voice carried across the gallery. I have every right to be here. This is a public event, isn't it? And I have information about these so-called artists that you should know. Marcus and Zora exchanged alarmed glances. Mrs. Whitfield had apparently decided to attend after all, and she was making a scene. Mr. Palmer frowned and moved toward the entrance, his cane tapping against the polished floor. What seems to be the problem here? The security guard looked relieved to see him. This lady is insisting on coming in before opening hours, sir. Says she has important information about tonight's exhibition. Mrs. Whitfield, dressed in what appeared to be her Sunday best, complete with white gloves and a pearl necklace, straightened her spine when she saw Mr. Palmer. Edward Palmer. Well, I never thought I'd see the day when Palmer Gallery would be showcasing vandals. A murmur went through the gathered crowd. Mr. Palmer's expression remained neutral, though his grip on his cane tightened. I'm afraid I don't understand, madam. May I ask your name? Eleanor Whitfield. I live next door to these two. She pointed at Marcus and Zora. And I've been reporting graffiti in our neighborhood for months. They're responsible. I've seen them sneaking around with their spray cans and paints, just like those hooligans back in the 60s, defacing public property during the riots. Diane stepped forward, her postal uniform standing out among the more formal attire of the gallery patrons. Mrs. Whitfield, that's enough. My children are legitimate artists who have been commissioned for several community projects. The spray paint and techniques you're referring to are part of their artistic method. Mrs. Whitfield scoffed. That's what they all say. Art. In my day, we called it vandalism. Mr. Palmer studied Mrs. Whitfield for a moment, then surprised everyone by smiling. Mrs. Whitfield, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps you'd like to view the exhibition properly. I'd be happy to give you a personal tour and explain the artistic context of Marcus and Zora's work. Before she could respond, he had taken her arm and was guiding her toward the first, painting a large canvas showing an elderly black man sitting on a porch. His weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes reflecting decades of history. This piece, for instance, titled Witness, employs traditional oil painting techniques combined with spray-painted elements that create a textural contrast symbolizing the intersection of past and present, Mr. Palmer explained. The subject is Mr. Washington, a civil rights activist who marched with Dr. King in Selma. Mrs. Whitfield stood silently before the painting, her expression unreadable. The crowd, sensing drama, had followed them and now watched the interaction with interest. And this series here, Mr. Palmer continued, moving to a wall displaying urban landscapes, documents the changing face of your neighborhood over the past year. Marcus and Zora spent months photographing and sketching these scenes before creating the final works. Zora, emboldened by Mr. Palmer's defense, stepped forward. That corner store used to be owned by Mr. Rodriguez until the rent got too high. And this building here was where the community center was before it was converted to luxury apartments. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes narrowed as she examined the paintings more closely. This is Maple Street. That's my house in the background. Yes, ma'am, Marcus acknowledged. We painted the whole street. It's part of our neighborhood portrait series. Something shifted in Mrs. Whitfield's expression, not quite softening, but a crack in her certainty. She moved from painting to painting, occasionally nodding or frowning, but no longer voicing her accusations. The official opening time arrived, and the gallery doors were opened to the public. Soon, the space was filled with art enthusiasts, local residents, and students from nearby colleges. Mr. Palmer had arranged for a small jazz trio to play in one corner, and servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Marcus and Zora found themselves surrounded by admirers, answering questions about their techniques and inspiration. Several red-soled dots began appearing beside their work as collectors made purchases. Diane watched her children from across the room, tears of pride in her eyes. She was so focused on them that she didn't notice Mrs. Whitfield approaching until the older woman spoke. Your children are talented. I didn't expect that. Diane turned, surprised by the almost compliment. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. They've worked very hard. Mrs. Whitfield nodded stiffly. I had a son, you know, he wanted to be an artist too. My husband and I, we didn't encourage it, thought he needed something more practical. She paused, her gaze distant. He ended up in banking, died of a heart attack at 42. Too much stress, the doctors said. Diane wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected confidence. I'm very sorry for your loss. Yes, well. Mrs. Whitfield straightened her shoulders. The world has changed a great deal since my day, perhaps not entirely for the worse. With that cryptic comment, she moved away, continuing her circuit of the gallery. As the evening progressed, the event grew livelier. Marcus and Zora's friends from school arrived, as did their teachers and neighbors. The community center director, who had first encouraged their artistic talents, made a toast to their success, recounting how the siblings had transformed a graffiti-covered wall into a mural celebrating local heroes. Around 8:30, Mr. Palmer clinked a spoon against his glass to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to make an announcement. Tonight has been even more successful than I anticipated. Every piece in the Johnson exhibition has sold. A cheer went up from the crowd. Marcus and Zora looked at each other in disbelief. Furthermore, Mr. Palmer continued, based on the extraordinary response to their work, I am offering Marcus and Zora a permanent relationship with Palmer Gallery, including funding for art supplies, studio space, and mentorship through their education. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was beyond anything they had hoped, for it meant security, opportunity, a future for her children in the field they loved. However, Mr. Palmer said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, there's something else we need to address. It has come to my attention that there may be some confusion about the nature of street art versus vandalism. He gestured toward a side door, and a middle-aged man in a suit entered, carrying a large portfolio. This is Detective Michael Rodriguez from the Community Relations Division of our police department. He's been working with young artists in the city to create legal spaces for street art and to educate the public about the difference between art and vandalism. Detective Rodriguez opened the portfolio to reveal photographs of murals and public art installations around the city. These works, including several by Marcus and Zora Johnson, were all created with permission from property owners or the city. They've been part of an initiative to revitalize neighborhoods through art. Mrs. Whitfield, who had been standing near the back of the crowd, stepped forward. But what about the graffiti on the abandoned factory on Cedar Street, and the paintings that appeared overnight on the boarding around the construction site on Maple? Marcus and Zora exchanged a nervous glance. Those were indeed their unauthorized works, created in moments of inspiration or frustration before they had found legitimate outlets for their art. Detective Rodriguez nodded. Those are examples of unsanctioned art. However, the property owners in both cases have since given retroactive permission for the works to remain, recognizing their artistic and community value. He turned to address Mrs. Whitfield directly. Ma'am, I understand you've made several reports about graffiti in your neighborhood. We appreciate citizens who are vigilant about their communities. But I'd like to invite you to join our Community Arts Council, where residents and artists work together to identify appropriate spaces for public art. Your perspective would be valuable. Mrs. Whitfield looked taken aback by the invitation. I'm not an artist. Neither am I, Detective Rodriguez said with a smile. But I know what I like, and I know what makes a neighborhood feel like home. That's all we need. The tension in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of celebration. As conversations resumed and the jazz trio started playing again, Zora approached Mrs. Whitfield hesitantly. Would you like to see how we work? She asked, holding up her backpack. I brought some of our supplies for demonstrations. Mrs. Whitfield hesitated, then nodded curtly. I suppose I should understand what all the fuss is about. Zora led her to a blank canvas that had been set up near one of the windows. She pulled out sketchbooks, brushes, and finally the spray cans that had been the source of so much contention. We start with a sketch, she explained, quickly outlining a simple street scene. Then we add base colors with traditional paints. She demonstrated, applying broad strokes of acrylic. And finally, we use the spray paint for details, texture, and atmosphere. She handed a can to Mrs. Whitfield. Would you like to try? The older woman looked scandalized. Me? Certainly not. I wouldn't know what to do. It's easy, Zora insisted. Just aim at the canvas and press lightly. You can't make a mistake in art, only happy accidents, as my teacher says. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Whitfield took the can. With Zora's guidance, she added a few tentative lines of color to the canvas. A small smile, perhaps the first the Johnsons had ever seen on her face, appeared briefly. It's rather satisfying, isn't it? She admitted. The moment was interrupted by a commotion at the gallery entrance. 2 police officers had arrived, and they were speaking to the security guard, who pointed in their direction. What now? Mr. Palmer muttered, moving to intercept them. Officer Daniels and his younger partner made their way through the crowd. We received a call about vandalism suspects at this location, Officer Daniels explained. Someone reported that the individuals responsible for recent graffiti incidents would be here tonight with evidence in their possession. All eyes turned to Mrs. Whitfield, who stood frozen with the spray can still in her hand. She had made the call earlier that afternoon after the Johnsons had left for the gallery, never expecting to find herself in this position. "That would be me," she said finally, her voice strained. "I made that call, but I was mistaken." The younger officer noticed the spray can in her hand. "Ma'am, is that—" "It's mine," Zora interjected quickly. "I was showing Mrs. Whitfield how we create our art. She's trying it herself." Officer Daniels looked around at the gallery full of artwork, the sold signs, the crowd of well-dressed patrons, and finally at Mrs. Whitfield's flustered expression. "Is there still a complaint, ma'am?" Mrs. Whitfield straightened her spine, making a visible effort to recover her dignity. "No. As I said, I was mistaken. These young people are artists, legitimate artists." The words seemed to cost her something to say, but there was also a note of wonder in her voice, as if she were surprising herself. The tension in the room broke, and someone in the crowd began to applaud. Soon, everyone was clapping, not just for the resolution of the conflict, but for the art, for the moment of connection between generations and cultures that had seemed so at odds. In the midst of it all, Marcus caught Zora's eye and smiled. They had faced obstacles before: financial hardship after their father's death, skepticism from teachers who didn't understand their vision, and the everyday challenges of being young black artists in a world that didn't always make space for them. But tonight, they had crossed a threshold. Their work was being seen and valued. Mr. Palmer approached with Detective Rodriguez. "I think we've all learned something tonight," the gallery owner said. "Art has the power to bridge divides and change perspectives. That's why I've been in this business for 50 years. Detective Rodriguez nodded. "And why I became involved with the community arts program. I've seen how it transforms neighborhoods and gives young people a positive outlet." He handed Marcus and Zora each a business card. "If you're interested in leading workshops for younger kids, give me a call. We need mentors like you." As the officers prepared to leave, Officer Daniels paused beside Mrs. Whitfield. "No harm done tonight, ma'am, but please think twice before calling us in the future. We're here for emergencies and actual crimes." Mrs. Whitfield nodded, looking somewhat abashed. After the police left, she turned to Diane. "I owe your family an apology. I've been set in my ways, suspicious without cause." Diane nodded, accepting the apology without elaborating. Years of prejudice couldn't be erased in a single evening, but it was a start. The exhibition continued for another hour, with more sales and commissions being finalized. By the end of the night, Marcus and Zora had not only sold all their existing work, but had received requests for several new pieces. As the crowd began to thin, Mr. Palmer gathered the Johnson family near the entrance. "You should be very proud," he told Diane. "Your children have extraordinary talent, but more importantly, they have something to say. That's what makes an artist." Diane hugged her children close. "Their father would have been over the moon tonight. He always believed in them, even when we could barely afford the art supplies." Mr. Palmer handed her an envelope. "This is the proceeds from tonight's sales, minus the gallery's commission. I think you'll find it's enough to make a significant difference for your family." When Diane opened the envelope and saw the amount, she gasped. It was more money than she had seen at one time since her husband's life insurance payout, enough to secure their housing situation, pay for college applications, and still have something left over. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Whitfield approached one last time. "I wonder," she said hesitantly, "if you might consider a commission for my living room, something with color, like that piece with the jazz musicians that sold earlier." Marcus and Zora exchanged surprised glances. "We'd be honored," Marcus said finally. "We could come by next week to discuss ideas." Mrs. Whitfield nodded. "That would be nice." The word seemed unfamiliar on her tongue in this context, but her expression had softened considerably since the beginning of the evening. Outside, the night air was cool and refreshing after the warmth of the crowded gallery. The Johnsons waited at the bus stop, still processing the events of the evening. "So," Diane said, breaking the comfortable silence, "how does it feel to be successful artists?" Zora grinned. "Like I'm dreaming, keep pinching me to make sure it's real." Marcus was more reflective. "It feels like responsibility. People are investing in our vision, our voice. We need to keep speaking truth through our art." "And what about Mrs. Whitfield?" Diane asked. "Think that change of heart is going to last?" Marcus shrugged. "Hard to say. People can surprise you." "She saw our work differently once she understood the context. Maybe she'll start seeing us differently too." As the bus approached, Zora leaned against her brother's shoulder. You know what Dad used to say, art doesn't just show people your view of the world, it helps them see their own world differently. Marcus nodded, tears stinging his eyes again. He was right, as usual. The bus doors opened, and the Johnson family boarded together, heading home to a future that suddenly contained many more possibilities than it had that morning. Behind them, the lights of Palmer Gallery continued to shine, illuminating the windows where their art had transformed not just a space, but perhaps, in some small way, the people who had gathered there. 3 weeks later, Marcus and Zora stood on Mrs. Whitfield's porch, a wrapped canvas between them. Their neighbor opened the door wearing an apron dusted with flour she had been baking, and the scent of cinnamon wafted into the spring air. "Right on time," she said, stepping back to let them in. "I've just put a coffee cake in the oven. Thought we might have a slice while we decide where to hang your painting." Her living room was exactly as they had imagined it, filled with furniture from the 1960s, doilies on the armrests, and photographs of a stern-looking man who must have been Mr. Whitfield. But there were surprises too, a record player with an impressive collection of jazz albums, and bookshelves containing volumes on art history and civil rights. Mrs. Whitfield noticed them looking at the books. "My late husband was a history teacher. He believed in understanding the past, even the uncomfortable parts." She paused. "Especially the uncomfortable parts." They unwrapped the canvas to reveal a stylized portrait of her house, rendered in their distinctive technique, part traditional painting, part street art. But they had added something special. On the porch of the painted house stood Mrs. Whitfield herself, younger, smiling, her hand extended toward a group of children playing in the foreground. "It's based on that photo," Zora explained, pointing to a faded photograph on the mantel that showed a much younger, leaner Whitfield standing outside a schoolhouse. "Your husband told us you were a teacher too before you retired." Mrs. Whitfield touched the canvas gently, her eyes misty. "4th grade for 37 years. She looked up at them. "How did you know?" "Detective Rodriguez helped us with some research," Marcus admitted. "We wanted to create something personal, something that captured who you are, not just where you live." Mrs. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. "You know," she said finally, "after my husband died and then my son, I felt adrift, angry at the world. It was easier to find fault than to connect." She gestured around the room. "I've been living in the past with ghosts instead of in the present with neighbors." She moved to the largest wall in the living room, directly opposite the sofa. "I think it should go here where I can see it every day. A reminder." As they helped her hang the painting, the timer in the kitchen went off, signaling that the coffee cake was ready. The scent of cinnamon grew stronger as Mrs. Whitfield bustled off to retrieve it. "I think Dad would approve," Zora whispered to Marcus as they adjusted the painting's position. Marcus nodded. "Of the painting, definitely. Of us spending Saturday morning with Mrs. Whitfield, he'd never believe it." They laughed together, the sound blending with the clatter of plates from the kitchen and the distant melody of a jazz record Mrs. Whitfield had put on. Outside, spring was in full bloom, bringing new colors to the neighborhood they had captured in their art, the neighborhood that had shaped them, challenged them, and ultimately celebrated them. Art hadn't solved every problem or erased every prejudice. Mrs. Whitfield still had moments of stiffness, and decades of ingrained beliefs wouldn't disappear overnight. But it had created a bridge where before there had been only a wall, a beginning, a possibility, a canvas not yet complete but full of potential. And for today, that was enough. If you're enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to hear more stories like this. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.